There's an overriding factor that's complicating every single environmental problem we're facing. Yet most environmental organizations refuse to talk about it, despite the fact that it's stifling progress on nearly every single front. In this video, I'm going to discuss why ignoring our human population growth is one of the greatest environmental and humanitarian betrayals of all time.
The definition of the word betrayal. Well, without a dictionary handy, I would define the word betrayal as a breach of someone's trust, or a breach of duty, or a breach of some obligation that you have to someone or something else. Most people would infer that it also results in some harm.
As a foreigner living in the US during the recent Trump presidency, it called my attention how many politicians and pundits completely changed their stance on him depending on what benefited them the most at the time. Like Mike Pompeo, for example, who once mocked Trump before he was elected and warned that he would be an authoritarian president who ignored our Constitution. But then, when Trump became president, Pompeo did a 180 and said that Trump should actually receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Or like the lawyer Jenna Ellis, who, before she was hired by Trump, said that he was an idiot, arrogant bully, an unethical, corrupt, lying, criminal dirtbag, an American fascist, one of the greatest threats to our liberty, treacherous, abusive, and unholy. But then, when she was later hired by Trump's team, she said Trump was a sincere Christian and the best president ever in all of modern history. So these people seem to betray their values in a very visible and kind of obnoxious way, just to be able to get some political advantage or a high-profile job. But sometimes our betrayals are not as obvious and as glaring as that. In fact, sometimes we betray things without even realizing it because we just don't know any better. Sometimes it's only in hindsight that we realize we were making a mistake or not aware of the full picture. But in the end, regardless of whether our betrayals are obvious and intentional or completely innocent and inadvertent, all of them ultimately have real-world consequences. A few years ago, I learned that there was a thing called palm oil, which is found in many things, from ice cream and pizza to deodorants and detergents. And I learned that our massive consumption of it was causing deforestation and that palm oil plantations had already killed about 50,000 orangutans. And I saw some very heartbreaking images, like this one here of an orangutan trying to fight off a bulldozer that's destroying his home. Or this one of an orangutan who was burned from our torching his forest. And I thought, well, what a wicked, horrible thing palm oil is. I'm going to try to avoid it best I can. So I started carefully reading the labels of everything I bought to try to avoid palm oil. For example, I noticed my granola had palm oil, so I replaced it for one that had coconut oil instead. And I was feeling pretty good about my changes, thinking how I was helping the forests and the animals of the world. But then one day, I came across a piece of information that really rattled and confused me. I read on the World Wildlife Fund website that palm oil is actually an incredibly efficient crop that produces more oil per land area than any other equivalent vegetable oil crop. And that switching to alternative oils like soybean oil or coconut oil would require us to use between 4 and 10 times more land, which would just shift the problem to other parts of the world and threaten other habitats and species. So to my surprise, the problem with palm oil seemed to be not necessarily the palm oil itself, but more so the sheer amount of oil we are now collectively consuming. And as much of an ecological disaster as palm oil plantations are, apparently displacing the massive amounts of palm oil we use globally with another type of oil would probably also be a disaster, and perhaps an even bigger one. So here I was, patting myself on the back, thinking that just because I bought granola that had coconut oil instead of palm oil, everything was a-okay. But that's just not the case at all. It turns out we have a much bigger and more complicated issue at work here. One that most environmental organizations seem to be unwilling to identify, address, or discuss. Scientists tell us humans are not living sustainably, that our population, consumption, and the growth economy have become unsustainable. And although most people seem to be very comfortable discussing how we need to reduce our consumption and how economic growth is impacting the environment, it seems the population factor is something virtually nobody wants to touch or even discuss. Back in the year 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists published a document entitled Scientists' Warning to Humanity, signed by more than 1,700 scientists, including the majority of living Nobel laureates in sciences at the time, expressing fear that humanity was pushing Earth's ecosystems beyond their capacities to support the web of life. The scientists pleaded that we stabilize the human population, describing how our large numbers exert stresses on Earth that can overwhelm other efforts to realize a sustainable future. That was back in 1992 when the world population was 5.4 billion. Now, only 30 years later, it's almost 8 billion and still growing. So needless to say, we did not heed their warning. Fast forward to the year 2017, scientists issued a second warning to humanity signed by over 15,000 scientists that said we are jeopardizing our future by not perceiving continued rapid population growth as a primary driver behind many ecological and even societal threats.
Modern humans have been around, they estimate, for probably around 200,000 years. And it took us all of those many tens of thousands of years to eventually reach a population of just 1 billion, which we did recently in the early 1800s. And since then, we've grown rapidly to roughly 8 billion, a little under 8 billion at the time of recording this in 2021. And projected to hit around 10 billion by mid-century. So it's pretty remarkable. If you look at it on a graph, I mean, it really is kind of a hockey stick kind of graph. I mean, it remains relatively low for almost the entirety of human history, and just in these last couple of centuries, it's gone almost straight up.
Even if family sizes used to be a lot larger in the past than what they are now on average, populations would not grow much because we had a very high infant mortality rate and a much lower life expectancy. So even things like a tooth infection or appendicitis often resulted in death not too long ago because we didn't even have antibiotics, for example. But with the technological advances in modern medicine and the agricultural revolution, we were fortunately able to increase our life expectancy and decrease infant mortality. So now more children are able to grow up, live longer, and have children of their own. And this in the aggregate resulted in a dramatic increase in the world human population in a very short period of time. It is very interesting that 11,000 years ago, there were just 1 million humans estimated to be on the planet. Because today, we actually grow our population by about 1 million people every 5 days.
Every year, we're adding about 80 million extra people to the planet, and that is about the population of Germany. So if you think about the need to find a good home for those people, to ensure that they have access to food, that they have access to clean water, that they have healthcare and education, it really puts things into perspective.
Given the kind of growth we are having, it's no surprise that it's affecting all of the environmental issues we face. And as expected, one of the many things it's affecting very directly are the other animals with whom we share this planet.
So our increasing population corresponds to an increasing impact that we have as a species on the environment. And the more of an impact that we have on the environment, you can translate that to mean, among other things, the more resources we're taking from the planet. The planet is finite, it has a finite amount of resources, and the more that we take for ourselves, the less there is for other species. And that means, to put it more concisely, it's going to be a reduction or a loss of biodiversity, and we're certainly seeing that.
Yes, we have seen a reduction. In fact, the word reduction feels like an understatement when we look at the numbers.
In about the last 40 years, we've lost more than half the wildlife on the planet.
Before we had our massive population growth, most of the biomass of mammals on the planet consisted of wild animals, and humans were less than 1% of it. But today, it's the other way around. Today, wild animals are estimated to be only 4% of the biomass, with the other 96% now consisting of humans, plus the billions of livestock animals that we breed into existence. According to the WWF, we're leveling on average 1 football pitch worth of forest every 2 seconds. So what do you think is going to happen to that tiny, tiny, tiny amount of wildlife that remains on the planet as we continue leveling the world's forests by 1 football pitch every 2 seconds, and as we keep growing our population by 1 new Germany every year? But despite the direct effect our growth is having on the environment and biodiversity, most environmentalists and environmental organizations appear to be unwilling or unable to talk about it. Take Leonardo DiCaprio, for example. He is very outspoken about biodiversity loss. He genuinely cares deeply about other species and the environment. He donates a lot of money and does a lot of work to try to stop species from going extinct. And I, for one, am very grateful and filled with admiration for all the important work he does. But I don't think I've ever seen Mr. DiCaprio recommend that we have fewer children. Of course, I don't have the pleasure of knowing him, so I don't know why he doesn't speak about it. But if I could, I'd love to ask him, Mr. DiCaprio, do you think the other species you rightfully care so much about stand a chance if we continue the kind of population growth we are having? Mr. DiCaprio also advocates for the forests in Brazil. And I'm glad he does, because thousands and thousands of acres are being torched and turned into farmlands every day. An area equivalent to 987,000 football pitches was deforested in Brazil in just 1 year. But my question for Mr. DiCaprio, and for all of the environmentalists who are silent about population, is: do you believe those beautiful forests in Brazil, in Indonesia, and elsewhere stand a chance of remaining as forests when we have a global human population that is growing by a new Germany every year? Do you think that the fact that we grow our numbers by a net growth of 1 million people every 5 days has no relationship with the relentless deforestation we are causing and the death and suffering of so many species who are losing their habitats? Of course, the fact that almost everyone is conspicuously silent about this issue has consequences. Like the fact that most people don't give a second's thought to the environmental implications of having children or the impact having large families has on the planet. It's innocent enough, but people just don't think about it.
A lot of people think the population problem is too many Indians or too many people in Africa and so on. Actually, it's too many people in the United States to start out with. You and I consume much more than the average person in Africa or the average person in India.
According to the US Census Bureau, in the year 1920, there were 106 million people living in the United States. Today, there are over 330 million people. So that means that in just the last 100 years alone, the US population has more than tripled in size. Yet, I've seen in the news recently a barrage of headlines that lament and say that the sky is falling because the US population grew in the last decade at the slowest pace since the Great Depression. But you know what? Despite all the lamenting, the reality is that according to the US Census Bureau, the United States grew by 7.4% between the years 2010 and 2020. And I understand that growth may be a slower rate of growth than previous decades, but it's still a 7.4% growth in just 10 years, which is a huge increase, especially for such a large and populous country like the US. The carbon legacy of having a child in the US is about 9,441 metric tons of carbon dioxide per child. By the way, the United States is the third most populous country on the planet. The point is, the natural world would benefit enormously right now if people all over the world had fewer children. Especially people in wealthier countries like the US, where every child has such a huge environmental footprint, but obviously everywhere in general as well. The negative consequences of our global overpopulation are being felt most harshly and most disproportionately in developing nations that have a lot of poverty. For example, I am from Mexico, and I will tell you that in Mexico, thousands of acres of forest are being destroyed every single year because they are being transformed into avocado plantations. It turns out that growing our population by a new Germany every year has unsurprisingly caused an increase in the worldwide demand for everything, including avocados, which happen to grow very well in Mexico because of our climate. So now, thousands of acres of forest in Mexico are being burned and cut every single year to turn them into avocado plantations to keep up with the worldwide demand for avocados. There are forests I used to go to as a little girl, which have now been completely replaced by avocado plantations. And there's no indication that the deforestation will be stopping anytime soon. Quite the opposite. The problem with avocado deforestation is not a consumption problem, in the sense that it's not an inefficiency issue. It's not like beef or dairy, which require huge amounts of land to produce. No. The underlying cause of the avocado disaster we are now experiencing in Mexico is simply the sheer amount of it that is now needed. Trying to keep up with, trying to satisfy the total global demand there now is for it. Because it turns out that just about everything we produce exerts an unsustainably harmful impact on the environment when we have to scale it up to satisfy a population of 8 billion people and growing. So my country of Mexico is already suffering the consequences of our global overpopulation in a very palpable way. And it may not be an intentional betrayal, but when I see people refuse to talk about overpopulation because it's an inconvenient or unpopular topic, when I see people who are not being directly affected by overpopulation right now dismiss it and ignore it, it does feel like a betrayal. It does feel like my people in Mexico are being betrayed by the world and by the environmentalist community when we keep growing our population by a new Germany every year, and when we fail to acknowledge our overpopulation. The Ivory Coast in Africa is slashing thousands of miles of rainforest to make room for more cacao farms to satisfy and keep up with the ever-growing demand for chocolate as it increases every day with our growing population. The people in the Ivory Coast are naturally upset and say we are causing the pure and simple disappearance of their forests. They will be wiped out. So we are betraying the people and the forests of the Ivory Coast when we keep growing our population by a new Germany every year. And we betray the people and the forests of the Ivory Coast by not raising awareness of our overpopulation. In Peru, they are having serious water shortages because much of their water is being used to produce things that are not for them. For example, they use a lot of water to produce asparagus to satisfy the growing worldwide demand for it, leaving the people who live in Peru hanging dry. So we are betraying the people of Peru when we continue to grow our population by a new Germany every year. And we betray the people of Peru by not raising awareness of our overpopulation. And I could go on and on and on with other examples like these of places all around the world that are being ravaged by the growing demand for whatever they produce there. From bananas in Costa Rica to lithium that is being mined in Chile that supplies the growing global demand for smartphone batteries. But coming back to palm oil, when even the production of vegetable oil from one of the most efficient oil crops that exists is causing an epic environmental disaster with unspeakable suffering and death for wildlife because of the scale of just how much oil we are now collectively using. When all of our activities from deforestation to pollution to urbanization have caused a 50% decline in wildlife in just 40 years and species are literally plummeting, then I think it could not be more clear that we are betraying every single wild animal, every single one of them, when we keep growing our population at a pace of 80 million people a year, and when we fail to acknowledge that this is a problem. So what is there to do? I believe, first and foremost, it is absolutely necessary to raise awareness about the issue. I really think that people would consider different choices about their family size if they were aware of the impact we are having. So I invite you to please help raise awareness, and please consider the planet when planning your own family size. Remember, we are currently in a severe environmental overshoot, and having a small family or adopting is one of the most impactful positive actions you can take to reduce your carbon and overall environmental footprint. Another crucial part of the solution is promoting women's rights and gender equality across the world. Because in addition to being basic human rights that we should all be promoting anyway, they also happen to be essential for a peaceful and sustainable planet. Reducing our consumption is also essential to having a sustainable world, and our diet plays a huge role on that impact. It has been well established that eating a plant-based diet uses dramatically less water, less land, and less energy than a diet that includes animal foods. Just as an example, when it comes to deforestation and land use alone, researchers have found that if we collectively shifted to vegan diets, we could reduce the total amount of global farmlands by more than 75%. Imagine that, 75% less land being used for farms. Can you imagine how helpful that would be for the environment and the animals? Given the grave situation in which we find ourselves, I think that for all of us with access to basic food options, it is a betrayal as well to keep eating animal foods when we know the impact it's having is so detrimental to the planet and wildlife and to the animals used for food themselves. So I invite you to ditch animal foods completely, starting today in your very next meal. Please avoid processed foods with palm and other oils as much as possible, as we have seen that they too are having a very detrimental impact on the planet, given the scale of how much of it we now collectively use. Eating a diet centered around unprocessed plant foods is much better for the environment. The stakes could not be higher, and continuing business as usual would be irresponsible and a betrayal in itself. Let's embrace reality and face our population situation with seriousness, reason, and logic. Let's not destroy the only planet we call home. If you haven't already, I invite you to watch the 90-minute environmental documentary I produced called Endgame 2050, which discusses these topics in a little more depth. You've seen a few clips in this video, but the full film is available on this YouTube channel and on our website, endgame2050.com. So what do you think about our betrayals? And are there any others you think should be on the list? Or is there anything you might be doing differently? Let me know in the comments below. And I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you can stay in the loop and be notified of the next video. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, please take care.